Let me welcome you into your 10-step fantasy football program. And if you're able to follow this to a T, you might as well start clearing off that shelf behind you because you'll have another fantasy football trophy to display at the end of the season. Headliner Nation, 10 steps. Easier said than done, but this is your 10-step guide to winning as many fantasy leagues as you possibly want here in 2025. I did a video very similar to this last year, and we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. But step number one for me in 2025 is F the ADP and set the queue. Now, you've heard us talk about setting your queue for a long time. It's one of the number one tips that we give people when going into your draft. Set the queue with guys that you want so you can keep track of them. Because this year, maybe more than ever, I'm saying F the ADP. Because there are several rounds where I don't really like guys that are going in that ADP area. And I am willing to draft guys one and maybe even 2 rounds ahead of their current ADP because I would rather get them on my roster because I believe in them that much. And you know we preach it every single season. ADP data is a tool for you to use to get an understanding on where players may or may not go. It should not be a blueprint that you follow and draft off specifically. You should be using it to try and figure out how early do I need to try and draft a player that I really love. For step 2, we need to have a heavy running back start to our draft. Over the last 3 seasons or so, we have seen a huge shift to a heavy wide receiver approach early in your drafts. And we've done video after video after video proving to everybody drafting high-end running backs first and having plenty of them is the easiest way to a fantasy football championship. Now, the good news is I think this year people have gravitated back towards that because they realize it. But unfortunately for all of us here at Headliner Nation, it is going to make starting running back heavy a little bit more difficult because more people want to do it now. And right now in round 1, I've got 6 running backs that I'm targeting on a consistent basis. Obviously at the top of the first round, Gibbs, Saquon, Bijan. These 3 guys are going to go within the top 4, maybe top 5 picks if you see somebody go with another wide receiver early. But what's going on with your team if you drafted the back end of the first round? Derrick Henry is still there. Absolutely love him. If you want to risk it with Christian McCaffrey, go for it. I'm not. I would rather have Christian McCaffrey in round 2, but it's all up to you. How much risk do you want to take with your team this year? In fact, there are 2 running backs currently going in round 2 that I would draft at the end of the first round before I go with a wide receiver. And that's going to be Bucky Irving and Josh Jacobs. Absolutely love Bucky Irving and his upside for 2025. And I will absolutely draft him in the first round. In round 3, I'm loving Kyren Williams and his ability to score touchdowns. And in round 4, Kenneth Walker. We'll talk more about Kenneth Walker and his injury history here later in the show. But for now, just know I love Kenneth Walker. I know Clint Kubiak loves Kenneth Walker, and the Seattle Seahawks are going to run the football a lot this season. So if you're a heavy wide receiver drafter, you're probably a little triggered after step 2 right now. But I ask you to hold on. Just see the rest of the video and what your team could look like because we are going to build out the best possible team based around all the steps I'm talking about. So for you wanting to get your wide receivers early, good news. There are 2 wide receivers that I want as my wide receiver 1. It would be Drake London in round 2, or it would be Tyreek Hill in round 2 or 3. For Drake London, if you've been around this offseason, you know that I've had this guy as high as wide receiver 4 this year. I absolutely love Drake London. And seeing what he did with Michael Penix at the end of the season, and seeing what he did with an inconsistent Kirk Cousins before that, leads me to believe, based on a lot of the underlying stats, that Drake London could have a massive year. And as your wide receiver 1, you're going to feel really safe with him. Let's talk about Tyreek Hill as your wide receiver 1 because he's one guy that absolutely has a chance to be a bust at his current ADP. There is risk associated with taking him, but if you want some upside, If you're willing to draft a guy like Christian McCaffrey early, then you should be really willing to draft a guy like Tyreek Hill early. But here's the thing. I'm willing to risk it with Tyreek Hill with an ADP in the third round, possibly moving a little bit early at the end of the second if Drake London is already gone. I'm not willing to risk my first round pick on a guy that has dealt with more injuries over the course of his career though. All right, we're going to get back to Tyreek Hill in just one moment, and we'll talk about his floor and upside a little bit more. But let's take a look at an updated team build if London or Hill are our wide receiver one. And for round one, we're going back to those 6 running backs that we talked about that I would absolutely take in the first round. Round 2, we're going with Drake London if he's available as our wide receiver one. Now, if London is gone, this is where we get to be a little bit more fluid with our roster and how we're drafting. And it's going to really depend on the other owners in your league and how they have drafted around you. Because what you could do if London is already gone, you could go early in the second round for either Kyren Williams or Tyreek Hill, and then come back to Williams or Tyreek Hill in the third round. If you do that, then you should have 2 running backs and a wide receiver to get things started. You'll have probably one of those main running backs that we talked about, Kyren Williams, and then either Drake London or Tyreek Hill. And then in round 4, that's where we're going with Kenneth Walker. But what are the chances of Tyreek Hill hitting 1,000 receiving yards in 2025? Right now over on Underdog, they have his current projection set at 999.5 receiving yards. Hitting 1,000 receiving yards to me is something that is still highly attainable even if Tua were to miss time again. Because in 2024, it was the first year since 2019 when Tyreek Hill missed 4 games that he was under 1,000 receiving yards. On top of that, he had 959 receiving yards last season, and that was with Tua missing 6 games and Tyler Huntley or Skylar Thompson being the backup. So yeah, I've got a good feeling about Tyreek Hill going over 1,000 receiving yards once again, especially considering the fact that he also was dealing with injuries last year and should be healthy now for 2025. And if you're not playing over on Underdog as of yet, then right now is a great time to start. Because if you head over to Underdog, download their app, create a new account, and deposit at least $10 using code word headliners, not only are you going to get an awesome deposit match to play a bunch of these games along with us, whether it be doing some pick'ems for the NFL season, or maybe even doing a few best ball drafts, but you're also going to get a free 2025 fantasy football draft guide from us. And again, all you need to do is create a new account and make at least a $10 deposit using code word headliners. As soon as you play your first game over there, whether it be pick'ems or a best ball draft, you're going to get your draft guide delivered to your email within 24 hours of completing that. And if you're playing some pick'ems, going higher than 999.5 receiving yards with Tyreek Hill absolutely should be in contention for one of your picks. But before we move on to step 4, let's hold ourselves accountable with a bonus segment that I like to call a look back, because I did a video very similar to this last season, although it was only 5 steps, but it ended up being very successful, and maybe it's an indication as to how much attention you should be paying to the rest of this video, especially if you haven't agreed so far. Now, in my 5 steps to fantasy football championships last season, there was one that I did have a little bit of a hiccup on, and that was my first step. And I talked a little bit about the highest upside players in the first couple of rounds. Unfortunately, it included guys like Christian McCaffrey and Breece Hall. There was a few other guys that hit, but I will say step 1 I wasn't entirely right on. But I nailed steps 2, 3, 4, and 5, because step 2 to fantasy football championships was drafting Mike Evans in the 3rd round. That turned out great. Step 3 was drafting David Montgomery as your RB3. Unfortunately, he got hurt at the end of the season, but prior to being injured, he was the RB10. And if you drafted him as your RB3 last year, You are getting top 12 production out of your third running back. That is absolutely a win in my books. Step 4, I talked about targeting George Kittle as your number 1 tight end. He absolutely blew up last season. Another W in the books if you followed that step. And then the final step was one that a lot of people questioned at the time, but now they're not questioning it. I told everybody, skip Josh Allen, skip Lamar Jackson, skip Jalen Hurts. If you want some rushing upside with your quarterback, draft Jaden Daniels instead. My 5 tips to fantasy football championships in 2024 absolutely killed it. Hit the like button for 10 steps that will do the same this year. Step 4, we need to get our wide receiver 2 in round 5. Now at this point, we have been very heavy with running backs, but we do need to turn our attention to the wide receiver position rather quickly. And there's a few guys in this area that I'm starting to like. And another thing that will pop up once again, F the ADP, because there's 3 guys in the 6th round that I would be willing to take a little early. The first wide receiver that I'm targeting in round 5 has to be DK Metcalf. A lot of people have left comments letting me know that there is no way they're getting on board with that here this season. And I get that to an extent, but I did a pretty deep breakdown on my must-have wide receiver video talking about why DK Metcalf could be a great wide receiver too, even if he doesn't have the upside that we're used to because of how solid his floor could be based on targets alone. Now, one guy that I haven't been fond of this year is Courtland Sutton. But if you're a Courtland Sutton fan and you feel like he's going to give you similar value to what he did last year, then absolutely draft him as your wide receiver 2 here. Am I taking him? Probably not. Do you like him? Then maybe you should draft him if you're feeling like your gut is telling you that's the call. Now, in round 6, there's 3 guys that I would draft early. Number 1, Tet McMillan. Again, maybe not a ton of upside, but his floor should be solid, especially with how the connection with Bryce Young already looked in their first preseason game. Do we want some upside? Maybe you went with Drake London and you want a lot of upside to go with him. Now, pairing these guys with Tyreek Hill are going to create a massive upside opportunity at the wide receiver position, but it also could make you maybe a little inconsistent or a little risky, and that's going to be George Pickens and Calvin Ridley. Now, Calvin Ridley has a shot to be the wide receiver 1 in Tennessee, and we already have seen how good Cam Ward looks in the preseason. Does that carry over to the regular season? Maybe, maybe not. But he should get the ball to Calvin Ridley a lot this year. And we know Calvin Ridley is one of the better deep play wide receivers in all the NFL. Now, George Pickens doesn't have the potential to be the wide receiver 1 on his team, because as long as he's healthy, that's clearly CeeDee Lamb. But having CeeDee Lamb and Jake Ferguson is going to give George Pickens a lot of one-on-one opportunities down the field. And hopefully this locker room, especially with an experienced vet at quarterback like Dak Prescott, might keep him a little bit more in line than what we saw during his time in Pittsburgh. Step 5, I'm drafting Tony Pollard as my RB4. The insane upside and floor that you will have at your running back position with this draft strategy is absolutely amazing. Tony Pollard's ADP still has not gone up after the Tajay Spears injury, which is absolutely crazy. I pulled this ADP literally right before I started recording this video to make sure he was still going in the 6th round. And he is. And just a quick side note, if you don't agree with the ADP that you see in the video today, then please write a letter to your fantasy platform of choice and let them know that the ADP data that they're publishing is not accurate, because the ADP data that we use is a consensus of several fantasy platforms in the industry. We're literally just giving you the information that they're telling us. But let's take a look at an updated team build once again if we continue to follow step 4 and step 5. Again, round 1, going with the running back, your choice. There's 6 guys that I like there. In round 2, London, Kyron Williams, or Hill. In round 3, Williams, or Hill. At that point, you should have 2 running backs and 1 wide receiver. And then in round 4, I want to go with Kenneth Walker. But here's a slight adjustment. Let's say you're not a Kenneth Walker fan, and let's say that you do want to lean a little bit heavier towards the wide receiver position. Well, you can make an adjustment here. Instead of going with Kenneth Walker, go ahead and go with a wide receiver 2 of your choice. And then in round 5, you can go with your wide receiver 3, with Tony Pollard being your RB3 in round 6. But if you do go with Kenneth Walker, then we're targeting our wide receiver 2 in round 5. Tony Pollard in round 6 is our RB4. And if you play in a 1 flex league while you're starting 2 running backs, yeah, one of these guys will end up being on your bench. But it's always a good thing to have really good running back depth. For step 6, there is no way that I'm considering a quarterback before round 7. The first guy that I'll consider this year is Bo Nix in round 7. Now, I talked earlier about mentioning Jaden Daniels last year as a late round guy to go with over some of those top tier guys. And basically, Bo Nix is like a diet version of that. Because last year I called Daniels a diet version of Allen Jackson and Hurts. Well, there's no way that Bo Nix is going to reach the upside of those guys. But he's a little bit more of a happy medium because you could pass on those guys early so you can really reinforce your running backs and your wide receivers. And then you could go with a guy like Bo Nix instead of waiting all that much longer. And with Nix, you're going to get some rushing upside. You're going to get some rushing touchdowns, and you're getting a guy that played very well as a rookie quarterback in a system that can be a little difficult at times. So you gotta hope that he gets better in his sophomore season. Now, in round 7, if that's still a little too early and you'd rather have somebody else, Dak Prescott is the next highest upside play. And every season that Dak Prescott has played at least 16 games, he's been a top 12 quarterback. Now, could he deal with injury issues again? Absolutely. Any player in football could at any given time. But this is a guy that hasn't really dealt with like soft tissue injuries over the course of his career. These have been issues that are kind of one-off injuries. And if he comes back and plays 16 games, he's likely a top 12 quarterback for you because over the course of his career, that's what he has been. Now, don't like Bo Nix, don't like Dak Prescott. In round 11, we are taking a look at Drake May or Jordan Love. Now, the Jordan Love pick is a little riskier than it was just a couple of days ago. He's having a minor procedure. He's fully expected to be back and ready to go by week 1. If you're risk adverse, if you're not really interested in dealing with that, especially given the fact that the surgery is taking place this far into camp, then don't worry about Jordan Love. If he plays week 1, he's got top 12 upside. But maybe you're interested in Drake May. If you're willing to risk it anyway, maybe Drake May has more upside. Reason for that, Drake May took over as the starter last season in New England in week 6. From week 6 through week 18, the quarterbacks that led the league in rushing during that span were Jaden Daniels, Lamar Jackson, and Jalen Hurts. At number 4, right behind those 3 names, it was Drake May. Now, Drake May during that time frame also missed 2 games where he played less than 20% of the snaps. Had he played both of those games and been fully healthy instead of needing to leave early due to an injury, he would have had more rushing yards than Jalen Hurts, and he would have been 3rd during that time frame. He loves to get out of the pocket. He runs very well. He could do a lot of that again in 2025. Now, one of the ultimate risk plays is J.J. McCarthy, because when you take a look at guys like last year with Jaden Daniels, the one player that matches up the best is J.J. McCarthy. He's got the arm strength, he's got the weapons, he's got the accuracy, and he can get outside of the pocket and run very well. Now, it's definitely a risk. Guys going into year 2 after missing the entire rookie season because of an injury. So how much do you trust J.J. McCarthy to be the guy? As a Michigan fan, I know what J.J. McCarthy is capable of. And if you're willing to risk it for the biscuit, he could be by far one of the best values in all of 2025. Step 7. I have 2 tight ends that I am targeting in 2025. It's either Evan Ingram in round 8 or it's Jake Ferguson in round 11. Evan Ingram with the Denver Broncos should take on a huge role. He was brought in for a purpose. Sean Payton loves having a tight end that can play a dynamic skill set, and Evan Ingram absolutely offers that. If he plays up to his potential this season, he has got top 5 potential written all over him, especially considering the fact that if you score a touchdown or have 60 to 70 receiving yards, you're going to be a tight end 1 on the week. Evan Ingram has that ability all the time. Jake Ferguson was a guy that I targeted last year, and it didn't end up working out, but his ADP is even better this year, going in round 11 now. And if the Cowboys have an issue running the football, they could look to some more short passes to really help pick up some of those yards. That's where Jake Ferguson comes into play, because with CeeDee Lamb drawing a ton of attention, George Pickens stretching the field, we could see Jake Ferguson with a ton of open room. And even if he's only picking up 5, 6, 7 yards at a time, if we can get him 8 targets in a game, that could end up being enough to make him a top 12 option sometimes as well. Step 8. Now this could go for really any of the running back starters that you draft. But because we talk specifically about Kenneth Walker in this setup, we're going to go step 8 by backing up Kenneth Walker with Zach Charbonnet. Now, it could be James Conner with Trey Benson. It could be Christian McCaffrey with Isaac Guerrero. There's a lot of different things going on. Heck, Breece Hall and Braylon Allen would be another one as well. You really need to be backing up your running backs with their backups. Now, if you own 4 running backs, you don't need all 4 backups, but you definitely should consider at least a couple of them to make sure if anyone goes down with an injury, then you're able to replace them right away. And I already mentioned it with Kenneth Walker. The Seattle Seahawks want to run the ball, and they want to run it an awful lot. Clint Kubiak has made that very clear, and he loves Kenneth Walker. So Kenneth Walker is going to get a pretty sizable workload based on everything that we've heard so far this training camp. If anything happens to Kenneth Walker, which over the last couple of seasons, history tells us he will miss some time, you're good. Zach Charbonnet steps in, and then Zach Charbonnet becomes a guy that has top 12 potential and maybe right around top 15 the entire year. So let's take a look at an updated team build once again. Round 1, we've talked about. Round 2, round 3, round 4, round 5, round 6. We've gone through all of those rounds previously. Round 7, Evan Ingram. We go with Evan Ingram a round earlier than his current ADP. In round 8, Dak Prescott. I end up going with him because in round 7 and round 6, instead of looking at Bo Nix, I'm looking at Tony Pollard and Evan Ingram. So give me a top 12 potential and Dak Prescott in round 8. 1 round before his ADP. And then in round 9, that's where we can target Zach Charbonnet, and now our running backs look fantastic. We've got several starters, we've got depth, we've got an injury backup if needed, we still have some very good wide receivers, we've nailed our tight end and our quarterback, but this is where people who love wide receivers are going to start to question a method to my madness, because they're going to be like, Kyle, you only have 2 wide receivers on your roster right now. Now keep in mind, we discussed skipping Kenneth Walker in round 4 if you really want another wide receiver instead, and then going wide receiver and going with running back Tony Pollard as your RB3 later. If that happens, then here in round 9, maybe Zach Charbonnet isn't the best bet, but you could still draft him as your RB4 if you really think something could happen to Kenneth Walker anyway. But in step 9, this is where wide receivers come into play. Because my wide receiver 3, I'm willing to absolutely start looking at a lot of shots, whether it comes to high potential for volume or high potential for upside. Because here's the thing, with a lot of leagues, if you're adding a 3rd wide receiver spot, that's fine. But the wide receiver 3 spot doesn't need to be just 12 potential guys. It could be anywhere from 15 to 18 different players with how close the scoring gets for wide receiver 3s. And if you're loaded at the running back position, you've got 2 starting running backs and a flex already. So it doesn't matter if you only have 2 wide receivers right now, because the plan is to flex a running back. It's not to flex wide receivers anyway. So now we can start building wide receiver depth. It's even better if you play in a 2 wide receiver league, because at that point you've got both of your starters and you've filled out all of your starters at this point. If you have a 3 wide receiver set, you don't have a third wide receiver. So let's go ahead and either get our third starter or our depth. And right now, this is where we're going to stockpile guys that either have high upside or high volume. So the high upside guys that I'm targeting really after or right at round 10 are going to be Matthew Golden, Cedric Tillman, Marvin Mims, Dante Thornton Jr. Those are the guys later in your draft that have the most potential for wide receiver 3 upside on a weekly basis. Now, high volume players, guys that maybe don't have a ton of upside. So if you play them, maybe they don't creep into wide receiver 2 territory, but their volume alone could keep them right in wide receiver 3. It could be Emeka Egbuka. It could be Demario Douglas. It could be Wan'Dale Robinson. All of these guys should see a plethora of targets. And if we end up going this route and we go through step 9 by adding wide receivers in this area, then this is what kind of our final team build is going to look like through 15 rounds. Now, once again, we've talked about a lot of these rounds already. We just went over Evan Ingram, Dak Prescott, and Zach Charbonnet. But in round 10, let's talk about Matthew Golden or Emeka Egbuka. If you want more upside as your wide receiver 3, it's Matthew Golden. If you want more safety, more floor, more volume, it's Emeka Egbuka. Do you want to grab a second tight end? In round 11, there's not a ton of guys that I'm looking at the wide receiver position that make me feel really warm and cuddly inside. So because of that, I'll take a second tight end in case Evan Ingram doesn't really work out. Worst case scenario, if both of these guys hit, you have a really nice trade chip. You could also go with a wide receiver 4 here if there's somebody else that you like a little bit more. In round 12, Marvin Mims Jr., a definite upside potential, depending on whether you went with Golden or Egbuka. In round 13, Dylan Sampson. I think he's a guy that could play a lot of snaps for Cleveland early on this year. In round 14, Demario Douglas or Wan'Dale Robinson. Again, high volume guys to go with the high upside guys we've already drafted. And then in round 15, you could look at your backup quarterback if you really want to draft one. I typically, in a 1 quarterback league, am not interested in it. However, I'll go ahead and put an option here just in case. You could do Geno Smith, Sam Darnold, Aaron Rodgers, Anthony Richardson if you want some upside, but you don't really care whether or not your QB2 hits. So after doing this strategy right here, you should have 1 to 2 quarterbacks, 5 to 6 running backs, 5 to 6 wide receivers, and 1 to 2 tight ends. And this is a question that I get asked a lot. And it kind of surprises me that I get asked this question so much. Kyle, when should I start drafting a kicker and a defense? And should I take one early? The answer is please do not worry about your defense or your kicker. And here is exactly why. Because last season, there were 4 defensive special teams units that were drafted outside the top 15 defenses, but finished inside the top 10. The Broncos, they were drafted as defense 22. They finished DST 1. The Vikings were drafted as DST 27. They finished as DST 2. The Packers, drafted as DST 19, finished as DST 3, and the Chargers were drafted as DST 26 and finished as DST 9. There's always defenses that are going to be drafted outside the top 15, even outside the top 20, that end up finishing as top 10 units. And some of these guys you take as your last round pick, you set it, and you forget it. And if you don't love what they're doing, then switch it up with a different team or stream throughout the rest of the year. For the kicker position, the value is even better because there were 4 kickers last year that weren't even drafted in fantasy leagues that were top 10 kickers by the end of the season. Chris Boswell, Chase McLaughlin, Jake Bates, who was one guy that I told I was like, hey, don't draft a kicker and just wait and pick Jake Bates up off waivers right before the season starts. He finished his kicker 7. And then Will Lutz, undrafted, finished his kicker 8. Defensive special teams and kickers. There's always going to be guys lurking around that you don't need to really worry about too often that will end up hitting if you take them with your last picks. And depending on where you're drafting during the offseason, if your league doesn't start for a couple of weeks or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, then draft more skill position guys. Hold on to them in case anything changes over the next couple of weeks, and then right before your season starts, drop 2 of your lower tier players that will never see time or didn't work out. Get your defense and your kicker then. Headliner Nation, those were my 10 steps to fantasy dominance, to absolutely destroying your fantasy draft and adding fantasy championship trophies to your shelves in 2025. Help us out on the road to 250,000 subscribers. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button and stick around for the rest of the off-season content, and then of course all of the in-season content you'll need to win your leagues. Hit the like button, subscribe if you're new here. Leave a comment down below. Are there any steps that you would add to this video that you're doing this year? Peace out, stay safe, and stay healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliner.
Analytics off the chain, other channels not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headliner Nation, we running the game.